Module 42, Social Influence. Social psychology's great lesson is the enormous power of social influence. This influence stems in part from social norms. On campus, workout clothes are the norm. On New York's Wall Street or London's Bond Street, business attire is expected. When we know how to act, how to groom, how to talk, life functions smoothly. But sometimes social pressure moves people in dreadful directions. Isolated with others who share their grievances, dissenters may gradually become rebels, and rebels may become terrorists. Shootings, suicides, and bomb threats all have a curious tendency to come in clusters. After a mass killing of 4 or more people, the probability of another such attack increases for the ensuing 13 days. Towers et al., 2015. Let's examine the pull of these social strings. How strong are they? How do they operate? When do we break them? Conformity, complying with social pressures. LOQ 42-1. How is social contagion a form of conformity, and how do conformity experiments reveal the power of social influence? Social contagion. Fish swim in schools. Birds fly in flocks. And humans, too, tend to go with their group, to do what it does and think what it thinks. Behavior is influenced by social contagion. A lion that sees another member of its pride yawn becomes 100 plus times more likely to yawn in the next 3 minutes. Quesada et al., 2021. If one of us humans yawns, laughs, coughs, scratches, stares at the sky, or checks our phone, others in our group will often do the same. Holly et al., 2012. Even just reading about yawning increases people's yawning. Provini, 2012, as perhaps you've just noticed. Tanya Chartrand and John Bargh, 1999, call this social contagion the chameleon effect, likening it to chameleon lizards' ability to mimic the color of their surroundings. They captured the effect by having students work in a room alongside another person, actually an accomplice working for the experimenters. Sometimes the accomplices rubbed their own face. Sometimes they shook their foot. Sure enough, students tended to rub their face along with the face-rubbing person and shake their foot along with the foot-shaking person. Social contagion also affects emotions. We human chameleons take on the emotional tones of those around us, their expressions, postures, inflections and even their grammar. Ireland and Pennybaker, 2010. Just hearing someone reading a neutral text in either a happy or sad-sounding voice creates mood contagion in listeners. Newman and Strack, 2000. This natural mimicry enables us to empathize. We smile and frown when others do, and then feel what others feel. This helps explain why we feel happier around happy people than around depressed people. It also helps explain why studies of groups of British workers have revealed mood linkage. The sharing of moods. Totterdell et al., 1998. Empathic mimicking, as when a conversation partner nods their head as you do, fosters fondness. Chartrand and Van Baren, 2009, Lacan et al., 2008. We tend to mimic those we like, and to like those who mimic us. Kampf et al., 2018. Just going for a walk with someone, perhaps someone with whom you disagreed, not only synchronizes your movements but increases rapport and empathy. Webb et al., 2017. When I see synchrony and mimicry, whether it concerns yawning, laughing, dancing, or aping, I see social connection and bonding. Primatologist Franz de Waal, The Empathy Instinct, 2009. Social networks serve as contagious pathways for moods, such as happiness and loneliness, drug use, and even the behavior patterns that lead to obesity and sleep loss. Christakis and Fowler, 2009. On websites, positive ratings generate more positive ratings, a phenomenon called positive herding. Muchnick et al., 2013. In a massive experiment on the 2010 U.S. congressional election day, Facebook showed 61 million people a message that encouraged voting, with a link to a local voting place and a clickable I voted button. For some recipients, the messages also contained pictures of Facebook friends who had already voted. Those who received "Tell your friends you voted" messages were slightly more likely to vote, and that difference generated an estimated 282,000 additional votes. Suggestibility and mimicry can also lead to tragedy. Following highly publicized mass shootings, people are more likely to purchase guns and threaten violence. Cooper, 1999, Porphyry et al., 2019. Spikes in suicide rates sometimes also follow a highly publicized suicide. Phillips, 1985, Phillips et al., 1989. What causes behavior clusters? Do people act similarly because they influence one another? Or because they are simultaneously exposed to the same events and conditions? Seeking answers to such questions, social psychologists have conducted experiments on conformity. Conformity and social norms. Suggestibility and mimicry are subtle types of conformity. To study conformity, Solomon Asch, 1955, devised a simple test. Imagine yourself as a participant in a supposed study of visual perception. You arrive in time to take a seat at a table with 5 other people. The experimenter asks the group members to state, one by one, which of 3 comparison lines is identical to a standard line. You see clearly that the answer is line 2, and you wait your turn to say so. Your boredom begins to show when the next set of lines proves equally easy. Now comes the third trial, and the correct answer seems just as clear-cut, figure 42.1. But the first person gives what strikes you as a wrong answer, line 3. When the second person and then the third and fourth give the same wrong answer, you sit up straight and squint. When the fifth person agrees with the first 4, you feel your heart begin to pound. The experimenter then looks to you for your answer. Torn between the unanimity voiced by the 5 others and the evidence of your own eyes, you feel tense and suddenly unsure. You hesitate before answering, wondering whether you should suffer the discomfort of being the oddball. What answer do you give? In Asch's experiments, college students, answering questions alone, erred less than 1% of the time. But what happened when several others accomplices of the experimenter answered incorrectly? Although most people told the truth even when others did not, Asch was disturbed by his result. More than 1/3 of the time, these intelligent and well-meaning college students were willing to call white black by going along with the group. Asch, 1955. Later investigations have not always found as much conformity as Asch found, but they have revealed that we are more likely to conform when we are made to feel incompetent or insecure, are in a group with at least 3 other people, are in a group in which everyone else agrees. If just one other person disagrees, the odds of our disagreeing greatly increase. Admire the group's status and attractiveness. Have not made a prior commitment to any response. Know that others in the group will observe our behavior. Are from a culture that strongly encourages respect for social standards. Why do we so often do as others do and think as they think? Why, when asked controversial questions, are students' answers more similar when they raise their hands and more diverse when they use anonymous electronic clickers? Stoll et al., 2010. Why do we clap when others clap, eat as others eat, believe what others believe, say what others say, even see what others see? Frequently, we conform to avoid rejection or to gain social approval. In such cases, we are responding to normative social influence. We need to belong. People are most conforming to social norms in collectivist and tight cultures, which prize group harmony, Stamcow et al., 2019. People also are responsive to dynamic norms to how norms are changing, such as toward eating less meat, consuming fewer sugary drinks, or supporting gay rights, Sparkman and Walton, 2017, 2019. At other times, we conform because we want to be accurate. Groups provide information, and only an uncommonly stubborn person will never listen to others. When we accept others' opinions about reality, as when reading online movie and product reviews, we are responding to informational social influence. Sometimes it pays to assume others are right and to follow their lead. One Welsh driver set a record for the longest distance driven on the wrong side of a British divided highway, 30 miles, with only one minor side swipe, before the motorway ran out and police were able to puncture her tires. The driver, who was intoxicated, later explained that she thought the hundreds of other drivers coming at her were all on the wrong side of the road. Woolcock, 2004. Is conformity bad or good? Conformity can be bad, leading people to agree with falsehoods or go along with bullying. Or it can be good, leading people to give more generously after observing others' generosity. Nook et al., 2016. The answer also depends partly on our culturally influenced values. People in many Asian, African, and Latin American countries place a high value on collectivism, emphasizing group standards. Western Europeans and people in most English-speaking countries tend to prize individualism, emphasizing an independent self. Experiments across more than 24 countries have found lower conformity rates in individualist and loose cultures. Bond and Smith, 1996, Gelfand et al., 2011. I don't know where we're going, but I'm following the crowd. Derek Evans, January 6, 2021, live streaming himself among the mob invading the U.S. Capitol. Like humans, migrating and herding animals conform for both informational and normative reasons. Claytier and Whiten, 2012. Following others is informative. Compared with a solo goose, a flock of geese migrates more accurately. There is wisdom in the crowd. And staying with the herd also sustains group membership. Ask yourself, how have you found yourself conforming, or perhaps conforming to nonconformity? In what ways have you seen others identifying themselves with those of the same culture or subculture? Retrieval practice. Answers in Appendix E. Obedience, following orders. LOQ 42-2. What did Milgram's obedience experiments teach us about the power of social influence? Social psychologist Stanley Milgram, 1963-1974, a student of Solomon Asch, knew that people often give in to social pressures. But what about outright commands? Would they respond as did those who carried out Holocaust atrocities? Some of Milgram's family members had survived Nazi concentration camps. To find out, the 26-year-old Yale professor undertook what have become social psychology's most famous and controversial experiments. Benjamin and Simpson, 2009. Imagine yourself as one of the nearly 1,000 people, mostly white men aged 20 to 50, who took part in Milgram's 23 experiments. You respond to an ad for participants in a Yale University psychology study of the effect of punishment on learning. Professor Milgram's assistant asks you and another person to draw slips from a hat to see who will be the teacher and who will be the learner. You draw a teacher slip, unknown to you, both slips say teacher. The supposed learner, a mild and submissive-seeming man, is led to an adjoining room and strapped into a chair. From the chair, wires run through the wall to a shock machine. You sit down in front of the machine and are given your task: teach and then test the learner on a list of word pairs. If the learner gives a wrong answer, you are to flip a switch to deliver a brief electric shock. For the first wrong answer, you will flip the switch labeled 15 volts slight shock. With each succeeding error, you will move to the next higher voltage. With each flip of a switch, lights flash and electronic switches buzz. The experiment begins, and you deliver the shocks after the first and second wrong answers. If you continue, you hear the learner grunt when you flick the third, fourth, and fifth switches. After you activate the eighth switch, 120 volts moderate shock, the learner cries out that the shocks are painful. After the 10th switch, 150 volts strong shock, he begins shouting, "Get me out of here. I won't be in the experiment anymore. I refuse to go on." You draw back, but the stern experimenter prods you, "Please continue, the experiment requires that you continue." You resist, but the experimenter insists, with statements such as, "It is absolutely essential that you continue, or you have no other choice, you must go on." If you obey, you hear the learner shriek in apparent agony as you continue to raise the shock level after each new error. After the 330 volt level, the learner refuses to answer and falls silent. Still, the experimenter pushes you toward the final, 450 volt switch. "Ask the question," he says, "and if no correct answer is given, administer the next shock level." Would you follow the experimenter's commands to shock someone? At what level would you refuse to obey? Previously, Milgram had asked non-participants what they would do. Most were sure they would stop soon after the learner first indicated pain, certainly before he shrieked in agony. 40 psychiatrists agreed with that prediction. Were the predictions accurate? Not even close. When Milgram actually conducted the experiment, he was astonished. More than 60% complied fully right up to the last switch. When he ran a new study, with 40 new teachers and a learner who complained of a slight heart condition, the results were similar. A full 65% of the new teachers obeyed the experimenter, right up to 450 volts, figure 42.2. In 10 later studies, women obeyed at rates similar to men's, Blass, 1999. Were Milgram's results a product of the 1960s US mindset? No. In a decades later replication, 70% of the California participants obeyed up to the 150 volt point, only a modest reduction from Milgram's 83% at that level, Berger, 2009. A Polish research team found 90% obedience to the same level, Dolinsky et al., 2017. And when a French reality TV show replicated Milgram's study, 81% of participants, egged on by a cheering audience, obeyed and tortured a screaming victim, Beauvois et al., 2012. Did Milgram's teachers figure out the hoax that no real shock was being delivered and the learner was in fact an accomplice pretending to feel pain? Did they realize the experiment was really testing their willingness to comply with commands to inflict punishment? Some did, and then became willing to play along, report Milgram's critics, Griggs et al., 2020, though Milgram reported that the teachers were often genuinely distressed, many sweated, trembled, laughed nervously, and bit their lips. Milgram's use of deception and stress triggered a debate over his research ethics. In his own defense, Milgram pointed out that, after the participants learned of the deception and actual research purposes, virtually none regretted taking part, though perhaps by then the participants had reduced their cognitive dissonance, the discomfort they felt when their actions conflicted with their attitudes. When a psychiatrist later interviewed 40 of the teachers who had agonized most, none appeared to be suffering emotional aftereffects. All in all, said Milgram, the experiments provoked less enduring stress than university students experience when facing and failing big exams, Blass, 1996. Other scholars, however, after delving into Milgram's archives, report that his debriefing was less extensive and his participants' distress greater than he had suggested, Nicholson, 2011, Perry, 2013. Critics have also speculated that participants may have been identifying with the researcher and his scientific goals rather than merely being blindly obedient. Haslam et al., 2014, 2016. For a helpful tutorial animation, watch this video, Research Ethics. In later experiments, Milgram discovered some conditions that influence people's behavior. When he varied the situation, full obedience ranged from 0 to 93%. Obedience was highest when the person giving the orders was close at hand and was perceived as a legitimate authority figure. This was the case in 2005 when Temple University's basketball coach sent a 250-pound bench player, Nehemiah Ingram, into a game with instructions to commit hard fouls. Following orders, Ingram fouled out in 4 minutes after breaking an opposing player's right arm. A powerful or prestigious institution supported the authority figure. Compliance was somewhat lower when Milgram dissociated his experiments from Yale University. People have wondered, why, during the 1994 Rwandan genocide, did so many Hutu citizens slaughter their Tutsi neighbors? It was partly because they were part of a culture in which orders from above, even if evil, were understood as having the force of law. Kamatali, 2014. The victim was depersonalized or at a distance, even in another room. Similarly, many soldiers in combat either have not fired their rifles at an enemy they could see, or have not aimed them properly. Such refusals to kill are rarer among soldiers operating long-distance artillery or aircraft weapons. Paget, 1989. Those who kill from a distance by operating remotely piloted drones also suffer stress, though much less post-traumatic stress than do veterans of on-the-ground conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq. G. Miller, 2012. There were no role models for defiance. Teachers did not see any other participant disobey the experimenter. The power of legitimate, close-at-hand authorities was apparent among those who followed orders to carry out the Nazis' Holocaust atrocities. Obedience alone does not explain the Holocaust. Anti-Semitic ideology produced eager killers as well. Feinstein, 2015, Mastroianni, 2015. But obedience was a factor. In the summer of 1942, nearly 500 middle-aged German reserve police officers were dispatched to German-occupied Józef, Poland. On July 13, the group's visibly upset commander informed his recruits, mostly family men, of their orders. They were to round up the village's Jews, who were said to be aiding the enemy. Able-bodied men would be sent to work camps, and the rest would be shot on the spot. The Holocaust did not start from gas chambers. This hatred gradually developed from words, stereotypes and prejudice through legal exclusion, dehumanization and escalating violence. Auschwitz Museum tweet, 2018. The commander gave the recruits a chance to refuse to participate in the executions. Only about a dozen immediately refused. Within 17 hours, the remaining 485 officers killed 1,500 helpless citizens, including women, children, and the elderly, shooting them in the back of the head as they lay face down. Hearing the victims' pleas, and seeing the gruesome results, some 20% of the officers did dissent eventually, managing either to miss their victims or to slip away and hide until the slaughter was over. Browning, 1992. In real life, as in Milgram's experiments, those who resisted were the minority. A different story played out in the French village of Le Chambon. There, villagers openly defied orders to cooperate with the new order. They sheltered French Jews destined for deportation to Germany, and they sometimes helped them escape across the Swiss border. The villagers' Protestant ancestors had themselves been persecuted, and their pastors taught them to resist whenever our adversaries will demand of us obedience contrary to the orders of the gospel. Rochet, 1993. Ordered by police to give a list of sheltered Jews, the head pastor modeled defiance. I don't know of Jews, I only know of human beings. At great personal risk, the people of Le Chambon made an initial commitment to resist. They suffered from poverty and were punished for their disobedience. Still, supported by their beliefs, their role models, their interactions with one another, and their own initial acts, they remained defiant to the war's end. Lest we presume that obedience is always evil and resistance is always good, consider the heroic obedience of British soldiers who, in 1852, were traveling with civilians aboard the steamship Birkenhead. As they neared their South African port, the Birkenhead became impaled on a rock. The soldiers calmed passengers and helped them onto 3 available lifeboats, not nearly enough for everyone. "Steady, men," ordered their officer as the lifeboats filled. Heroically, no one frantically rushed to claim a lifeboat seat. As the boat sank, all left on board were plunged into the sea, most to be drowned or devoured by sharks. For almost a century, noted James Michener, 1978, the Birkenhead drill remained the measure by which heroic behavior at sea was measured. Lessons from the Conformity and Obedience Studies. LOQ 42-3. What do the social influence studies teach us about ourselves? How much power do we have as individuals? How do the laboratory experiments on social influence relate to everyday life? How does judging the length of a line or flicking a shock switch relate to everyday social behavior? Psychology's experiments aim not to recreate the actual, complex behaviors of everyday life but to capture and explore the underlying processes that shape those behaviors. Solomon Asch and Stanley Milgram devised experiments that forced a familiar choice: do I adhere to my own standards, even when they conflict with the expectations of others? In Milgram's experiments and their modern replications, participants were torn. Should they respond to the pleas of the victim or the orders of the experimenter? Their moral sense warned them not to harm another, yet it also prompted them to obey the experimenter and to be a good research participant. With kindness and obedience on a collision course, obedience usually won. These experiments demonstrated that strong social influences induce many people to conform to falsehoods or capitulate to cruelty. Milgram saw this as the fundamental lesson of this work: ordinary people, simply doing their jobs, and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. 1974, p. 6. Focusing on the endpoint 450 volts, or someone's real-life violence, we can hardly comprehend the inhumanity. But Milgram did not entrap his teachers by asking them first to zap learners with enough electricity to make their hair stand on end. Using the foot in the door technique, he instead began with a little tickle of electricity and escalated step by step. To those throwing the switches, the small action became justified, making the next act tolerable. So it happens when people succumb, gradually, to evil. All evil begins with 15 volts. Philip Zimbardo, Stanford Lecture, 2010. In any society, great evils often grow out of people's compliance with lesser evils. The Nazi leaders suspected that most German civil servants would resist shooting or gassing Jews directly, but they found them willing to handle the paperwork of the Holocaust. Silver and Geller, 1978. Milgram found a similar reaction in his experiments. When he asked 40 men to administer the learning test while someone else did the shocking, 93% complied. Cruelty does not require devilish villains. All it takes is ordinary people corrupted by an evil situation. Ordinary students may follow orders to haze initiates into their group. Ordinary employees may follow orders to produce and market harmful products. Among people abducted into a violent group, those forced to perpetrate violence are most likely then to identify with the group. Littman, 2018. Attitudes follow behavior. I was only following orders. Adolf Eichmann, director of Nazi deportation of Jews to concentration camps. In Joseph and Le Chambon, as in Milgram's experiments, those who resisted usually did so early. After the first acts of compliance or resistance, attitudes began to follow and justify behavior. What have social psychologists learned about the power of the individual? Social control, the power of the situation, and personal control, the power of the individual, interact. Much as water dissolves salt but not sand, so rotten situations turn some people into bad apples while others resist. Johnson, 2007. When feeling pressured, some people react by doing the opposite of what is expected. Rosenberg and Siegel, 2018. The power of one or two individuals to sway majorities is minority influence. Moscovici, 1985. One research finding repeatedly stands out. When you are the minority, you are far more likely to sway the majority if you hold firmly to your position and don't waffle. This tactic won't make you popular, but it may make you influential, especially if your self-confidence stimulates others to consider why you think as you do. Even when a minority's influence is not yet visible, people may privately develop sympathy for the minority position and rethink their views. Wood et al., 1994. The powers of social influence are enormous, but so are the powers of the committed individual. Were this not so, communism would have remained an obscure theory, Christianity would be a small Middle Eastern sect, and Rosa Parks' refusal to sit at the back of the bus would not have ignited the U.S. civil rights movement. Social forces matter. But individuals matter, too. Retrieval practice. Answers in Appendix E. Group behavior. LOQ 42-4. How does the presence of others influence our actions, via social facilitation, social loafing, and de-individuation? Imagine standing in a room holding a fishing pole. Your task is to wind the reel as fast as you can. On some occasions you wind in the presence of another participant, who is also winding as fast as possible. Will the other's presence affect your own performance? In one of social psychology's first experiments, Norman Triplett, 1898, reported that adolescents would wind a fishing reel faster in the presence of someone doing the same thing. Although a modern reanalysis revealed that the difference was modest, Stroebe, 2012, Triplett inspired later social psychologists to study how others' presence affects our behavior. Group influences operate both in simple groups, one person in the company of another, and in more complex groups. Social facilitation. Triplett's claim of strengthened performance in others' presence is called social facilitation. But further studies revealed that the truth is more complicated. The presence of others strengthens our most likely response, the correct one on an easy task, an incorrect one on a difficult task. Garin, 1986, Zajonc, 1965. Why? Because when others observe us, we become aroused, and this arousal amplifies our reactions. Perhaps you, like most people, tend to eat more when eating with others. Ruddock et al., 2019? Or consider the expert pool players who made 71% of their shots when alone, and 80% when 4 people came to watch them. Michaels et al., 1982. Poor shooters, who made 36% of their shots when alone, made only 25% when watched. The energizing effect of an enthusiastic audience helps explain the home team advantage. Studies of more than 250,000 college and professional athletic events in various countries have shown a home team advantage of 54% in Major League Baseball games, 60% in National Basketball Association games, and 63% in English Premier League football, soccer, games. Allen and Jones, 2014, Jameson, 2010, Moskowitz and Wertheim, 2011. But in pandemic-era empty stadiums, the home advantage dissipated or disappeared in European professional football matches. Hamilton, 2021, Leitner and Richlon, 2021, Tilp and Thaler, 2020. The point to remember: what you do well, you are likely to do even better in front of an audience, especially a friendly audience. What you usually find difficult may seem all but impossible when you are being watched. Social facilitation also helps explain a funny effect of crowding. Comedians know that a good house is a full one. What they may not know is that crowding triggers arousal. Comedy routines that are mildly amusing in an uncrowded room seem funnier in a densely packed room. ILOETAL, 1983, Friedman and Perlich, 1979. When seated close to one another, people like a friendly person even more and an unfriendly person even less. Schiffenbauer and Schiavo, 1976, Storms and Thomas, 1977. So, to energize your next event, choose a room or set up seating that will just barely accommodate everyone. Social loafing. Social facilitation experiments test the effect of others' presence on the performance of an individual task, such as shooting pool. But what happens when people perform as a group, say, in a team tug of war? Would you exert more, less, or the same effort as in a one-on-one match? To find out, a University of Massachusetts research team asked blindfolded students to pull as hard as they can on a rope. When they fooled the students into believing 3 others were also pulling behind them, students exerted only 82% as much effort as when they knew they were pulling alone. Ingham et al., 1974. And consider what happened when blindfolded people seated in a group clapped or shouted as loudly as they could while hearing, through headphones, other people clapping or shouting loudly. Lotain, 1981. When they thought they were part of a group effort, the participants produced about 1/3 less noise than when clapping or shouting alone. This diminished effort is called social loafing. Jackson and Williams, 1988, Lotain, 1981. Experiments in the United States, India, Thailand, Japan, China, and Taiwan have found social loafing on various tasks, though it was especially common among men in individualist cultures. Carow and Williams, 1993. What causes social loafing? When people act as part of a group, they may feel less accountable and therefore worry less about what others think. View individual contributions as dispensable. Harkins and Zymanski, 1989, Kerr and Brune, 1983. Overestimate their own contributions, downplaying others' efforts. Schroeder et al., 2016. Free ride on others' efforts. Unless highly motivated and strongly identified with the group, people may slack off, as you may have observed on group assignments, especially when they share equally in the benefits, regardless of how much they contribute. Ask yourself, what steps could you take to reduce social loafing in your next group project assignment? De-individuation. We've seen that the presence of others can arouse people, social facilitation, or it can diminish their feelings of responsibility, social loafing. But sometimes the presence of others does both. The uninhibited behavior that results can range from a food fight to vandalism or rioting. This process of losing self-awareness and self-restraint, called de-individuation, often occurs when group participation makes people both aroused and anonymous. Compared with identifiable women in a control group, New York University women dressed in depersonalizing Ku Klux Klan style hoods delivered twice as much presumed electric shock to a victim. Zimbardo, 1970. Groups tend to be more immoral than individuals. Martin Luther King, Jr., letter from Birmingham Jail, 1963. De-individuation thrives in many settings. Internet anonymity enables people to feed and freely express their anger, sometimes with bullying and hate speech. Chetty and Alathur, 2018, Kowalski et al., 2018. Online trolls report enjoying their unleashed abuse of others, Buckles et al., 2014, Sist and March, 2017. They might never say "you're disgusting" to someone's face, but they can hide behind their anonymity online. One study showed that tribal warriors wearing face paint or masks were more likely than those with exposed faces to kill, torture, or mutilate captured enemies. Watson, 1973. When we shed self-awareness and self-restraint, whether in a mob, at a concert, at a ball game, or at worship, we become more responsive to the group experience, bad or good. For a comparison of social facilitation, social loafing, and de-individuation, see Table 42.1. We have examined the conditions under which the presence of others can motivate people to exert themselves or tempt them to free ride on the efforts of others, make easy tasks easier and difficult tasks harder, and enhance humor or fuel mob violence. Research also shows that interacting with others can similarly have both bad and good effects. Group polarization. LOQ 42-5. How can group interaction enable group polarization? We live in an increasingly polarized world. The Middle East is torn by warring factions. The European Union is struggling with nationalist divisions. In 1990, a one-minute speech in the U.S. Congress would enable you to guess the speaker's party just 55% of the time. By 2009, partisanship was evident 83% of the time. Jenskow et al., 2016. In 2016, for the first time in survey history, most U.S. Republicans and Democrats reported having very unfavorable views of the other party. Doherty and Kiley, 2016. People in both parties believe that my side is objective, and the other side is biased. Schwalb et al., 2020. U.S. polarization reached an extreme in early 2021, when pro-Trump insurrectionists invaded the U.S. Capitol and anti-Trump citizens were outraged. A powerful principle helps us understand this increasing polarization. The beliefs and attitudes we bring to a group grow stronger as we discuss them with like-minded others. This process, called group polarization, can have beneficial results, as when low-prejudice students become even more accepting while discussing racial issues. As George Bishop and IDM discovered, it can also be socially toxic, as when high-prejudice students who discuss racial issues together become more prejudiced. Myers and Bishop, 1970, Figure 42.3. Our repeated finding, like minds polarize. Analyses of terrorist organizations reveal that the terrorist mentality emerges slowly among those who share a grievance. Macaulay, 2002, Macaulay and Siegel, 1987, Murari, 2002. As susceptible individuals interact in isolation, sometimes with other brothers and sisters in camps or prisons, their views grow more extreme. Increasingly, they categorize the world as us against them. Kalov, 2014, Mogadam, 2005. Knowing that group polarization occurs when like-minded people segregate, a 2006 U.S. National Intelligence estimate speculated that the operational threat from self-radicalized cells will grow. The Internet offers us a connected global world, yet also provides an easily accessible medium for group polarization. When IDM got my start in social psychology with experiments on group polarization, I never imagined the potential power of polarization in virtual groups. Progressives friend progressives and share links to sites that affirm their shared views. Conservatives connect with conservatives and likewise share conservative perspectives. With news feeds and retweets, we fuel one another with information and misinformation and click on content we agree with. Hills, 2019. Social media echo chambers may amplify extremist messages, which tend to be more visible and more likely to be shared. Bale, 2021. The result is an outrage machine, Our biases may lead us to welcome and share misinformation that supports our beliefs, which strengthens our biases, and leads to even more polarization. In 2018, a U.S. man sent over a dozen pipe bombs to prominent Democrats and their perceived supporters after venting his partisan resentments on the internet, which echoed them back. It validated and cultivated them. It took something dark and colored it darker still. Bruni, 2018. Dear Satan, thank you for having my internet news feeds tailored especially for me. Comedian Steve Martin, 2016. Mindful of the viral false news phenomenon, tech companies are working on ways to promote media information literacy. For more on the internet's role in group polarization toward ends that are good as well as bad, see Thinking Critically About the Internet as Social Amplifier. LOQ 42-6. What role does the internet play in group polarization? Groupthink. LOQ 42-7. How can group interaction enable groupthink? Does group influence ever distort important national decisions? Consider the Bay of Pigs fiasco. In 1961, U.S. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors decided to invade Cuba with 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles. When the invaders were easily captured and quickly linked to the U.S. government, Kennedy wondered aloud, "How could I have been so stupid?" Social psychologist Irving Janis, 1982, studied the decision-making process leading to the ill-fated invasion. He discovered that the soaring morale of the recently elected president and his advisors fostered undue confidence. To preserve the good feeling, group members suppressed or self-censored their dissenting views, especially after President Kennedy voiced his enthusiasm for the scheme. Since no one spoke strongly against the idea, everyone assumed the support was unanimous. To describe this harmonious but unrealistic group thinking, Janis coined the term groupthink. Later studies showed that groupthink fed by overconfidence, conformity, self-justification, and group polarization contributed to other fiascos. Among them were the failure to anticipate the 1941 Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the escalation of the Vietnam War, the U.S. Watergate cover-up, the Chernobyl nuclear reactor accident, Reason, 1987, the U.S. Space Shuttle Challenger explosion, Esser and Linda Erfurter, 1989, and the Iraq War, launched on the false belief that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee, 2004. One of the dangers in the White House, based on my reading of history, is that you get wrapped up in groupthink and everybody agrees with everything, and there's no discussion and there are no dissenting views. Barack Obama, December 1, 2008, press conference. Despite the dangers of groupthink, two heads are often better than one. Great minds often don't think alike. Knowing this, Janis also studied instances in which U.S. presidents and their advisors collectively made good decisions, such as when the Truman administration formulated the Marshall Plan, which offered assistance to Europe after World War II, and when the Kennedy administration successfully prevented the Soviets from installing missiles in Cuba. His conclusion? Groupthink is prevented when a leader, whether in government or in business, welcomes various opinions, invites experts' critiques of developing plans, and assigns people to identify possible problems. Just as the suppression of dissent bends a group toward bad decisions, open debate often shapes good ones. This is especially the case with small but diverse groups, whose varied backgrounds and perspectives often enable creative or superior outcomes. Shi et al., 2019, J. Wang, et al., 2019, L. Wu et al., 2019. None of us is as smart as all of us. If evil is contagious, so is goodness. Pope Francis tweet, 2017. Ask yourself: have you witnessed or experienced group polarization online? Retrieval practice. Answers in Appendix E. Review. Module 42, Social Influence. Learning objectives. Test yourself. Answer these repeated learning objective questions on your own, before showing the answers here, or checking the answers in Appendix D, to improve your retention of the concepts. McDaniel et al., 2009, 2015. Terms and concepts to remember. Test yourself. Write down the definition in your own words, then check your answer. Norms. Conformity. Normative social influence. Informational social influence. Social facilitation. Social loafing. De-individuation. Group polarization. Groupthink. Module test. Test yourself. Answer the following questions on your own first, then show the answers here, or check your answers in Appendix E. Module 43, Antisocial Relations. Autheal psychology studies how we think about and influence one another, and also how we relate to one another. What causes people sometimes to hate and harm, and other times to love and help? And when conflicts arise, how can we move toward a just peace? In this section we ponder insights into antisocial relations gleaned by researchers who have studied prejudice, aggression, and conflict. Prejudice. LOQ 43-1. What is prejudice? How do explicit and implicit prejudice differ? Prejudice means prejudgment. It is an unjustifiable and usually negative attitude toward a group and its members, who often are people of a particular racial or ethnic group, gender, mental health, or physical ability group, or sexual orientation. Attitudes are feelings, influenced by beliefs, that predispose us to act in certain ways. The ingredients in prejudice's three-part mixture are negative emotions, such as fear or disgust. Strong negative emotions are not problematic alone, but when they are projected toward another group without justification, they can be harmful. Feeling scared when approached by someone with mental illness can lead us to avoid or reject them. Hinshaw, 2009. Feeling disgust in response to others' differing sexual orientation can lead to disapproval of such differences. Inbar et al., 2009. Stereotypes, or generalized beliefs about a group of people such as corrupt media or vulture capitalists. Our stereotypes sometimes reflect reality. Jussim and Honeycutt, 2021. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas once observed, "It's a stereotype that Texans like barbecue. It also happens that pretty much all Texans like barbecue." Flegenheimer, 2018. Other stereotypes like those based on astrological signs fail to predict personality or performance. Liu et al., 2020. Stereotypes often overgeneralize or exaggerate group traits and behaviors, and can even push people into undesirable roles that fit the stereotype. Eagley and Koenig, 2021. In the United States, for example, strongly partisan Republicans and Democrats exhibit a perception gap. They overestimate the extremism of the other side. Yudkin et al., 2019. Moreover, Democrats greatly overestimate the percent of Republicans who earn more than $250,000 a year, and Republicans greatly overestimate the percent of Democrats who are LGBTQ. Aller and Sood, 2018. A predisposition to discriminate, to act in harmful and unjustifiable ways toward members of the group. Sometimes prejudice is blatant. People with anti-black attitudes, for example, are less likely to judge as guilty a white police officer who killed a black man. Cooley et al., 2019. Other times, it is more subtle. taking the form of microaggressions, such as being ignored at the deli counter. Williams, 2021. In experiments, people seeking Airbnb reservations have received worse treatment when calling themselves Jamal rather than John, or Lakeisha rather than Emily. Edelman et al., 2017. People also experience prejudice because of their weight, age, or physical appearance. Lipens et al., 2022, Steer and Hinshaw, 2017, Zhu et al., 2022. To automatically perceive an older person as incapable or a less attractive person as incompetent is to be prejudiced. To reject a qualified job candidate who is older than most other applicants or is a woman instead of a man is to discriminate. Body weight bias. In data collected from 4 million U.S. adults, explicit biases against those of a particular sex, disability, age, or race were greatly exceeded by biases in response to body weight. Charlesworth and Banerjee, 2019. Explicit and implicit prejudice. Again and again, we have seen that our brain processes thoughts, memories, and attitudes on two different tracks. Sometimes that processing is explicit on the radar screen of our awareness. More often, it is implicit and unthinking knee-jerk response operating below the radar, leaving us unaware of how our attitudes influence our behavior. In 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court, in upholding the Fair Housing Act, recognized implicit bias research, noting that unconscious prejudices can cause discrimination even when people do not consciously intend to discriminate. Psychologists study implicit prejudice by testing for automatic group associations. Tests in which people quickly pair a person's image with a trait demonstrate that even people who deny any racial prejudice may exhibit negative associations. Greenwald and Banerjee, 2017. Millions of people have taken the implicit association test, as you can, too, at implicit.harvard.edu. Critics question the test's reliability and caution against using it to assess or label individuals. Gvam et al., 2022, Oswald et al., 2015. But defenders counter that implicit biases predict behaviors ranging from simple acts of friendliness to work quality. Greenwald et al., 2022. Implicit biases have also mirrored cultural trends toward greater acceptance of various groups. In the United States between 2007 and 2020, for example, people's implicit biases regarding sexual orientation and race decreased. Charlesworth and Banerjee, 2022. Considering automatic patronization. In one experiment, white university women assessed flawed student essays they believed had been written by either a white or a black student. The women gave low evaluations, often with harsh comments, to the essays supposedly written by a white student. Their assessment was more positive when the same essay was attributed to a black student. Harbour, 1998. In follow-up studies, male and female research participants similarly patronized female authors. When evaluating an author's essay, participants offered uplifting but inaccurate feedback to women, but not to men. Jampol and Zayas, 2021. In real-world evaluations, such low expectations and the resulting white lies of inflated praise and insufficient criticism could hinder minority student and female achievement. To reduce implicit bias, teachers may read essays without knowing the author's race and gender. Monitoring reflexive bodily responses. Even people who consciously express little prejudice may give off telltale signals as their body responds selectively to an image of a person from another ethnic group. Neuroscientists can detect signals of implicit prejudice in the viewer's facial muscle responses and in the activation of the emotion processing amygdala. Cunningham et al., 2004, Eberhardt, 2005, Stanley et al., 2008. But who can detect their errors? Clear me from hidden faults. Psalm 19:12. Targets of prejudice. LOQ 43-2. What groups tend to experience prejudice? Racial and ethnic prejudice. Expressed racial attitudes in the United States have undergone a sea change. Support for interracial marriage between black and white people, for example, increased from a mere 4% approval in 1958 to 94% in 2021, Gallup, 2021. 3 in 4 Americans, including nearly 9 in 10 college graduates, now agree that their nation's having many different races and ethnicities is good for the country, Horowitz, 2019. The diversity benefit appeared in one analysis of 9 million scientific papers and 6 million scientists. Ethnically diverse scientific teams produced the most influential research, Al-Shebly et al., 2018. Data show long-term plunges in extreme poverty, illiteracy, war, violent crime, racism, sexism, homophobia, domestic violence, disease, lethal accidents, and just about every other scourge. Psychologist Steven Pinker, Scared by the News. Take the Long View, 2018. Yet interracial prejudice persists. Colorism. Among Black and Hispanic people, and also among people in India and some East Asian cultures, those with darker skin tones experience greater prejudice and discrimination. Bettake, 2020, Gonzalez Barrera, 2019, Landor and Smith, 2019, Yasser and Get-Lehman, 2020. Criminal stereotypes. Black men are judged more harshly than white men when they commit stereotypically black crimes, drive-by shooting, gang violence, street gambling. But this bias disappears when black men commit stereotypically white crimes, embezzlement, computer hacking, and insider trading. Petsko and Bodenhausen, 2019. Medical care. Health professionals allocate more resources to treat white patients than to treat equally unhealthy black patients. Obermeyer et al., 2019. In one study of medical care in Louisiana, inequalities in medical treatment helped explain why Black Americans were more likely than white Americans to die from COVID. Hu et al., 2022. Why does such prejudice persist? One reason is that few people muster the courage to challenge prejudicial or hate speech. Although many say they would feel upset with someone making racist, or homophobic, comments, they often respond indifferently when hearing prejudice-laden language. Kawakami et al., 2009. The bottom line, if you disapprove of prejudice, ask yourself, what message am I sending when I remain silent while others make racist, homophobic, or sexist remarks? As noted, prejudice is not just subtle, but often automatic and unintended, implicit. An implicit association test found 9 in 10 white respondents taking longer to identify pleasant words, such as peace and paradise, as good when presented with black-sounding names, such as Letitia and Darnell, than when shown white-sounding names, such as Katie and Ian. Moreover, people who more quickly associate good things with white names or faces also are the quickest to perceive anger and apparent threat in black faces. Hugenberg and Bodenhausen, 2003. Those demonstrating explicit or implicit prejudice were less likely to vote for then presidential candidate Barack Obama. Multiple studies showed, however, that Obama's election reduced implicit prejudice. Bernstein et al., 2010, Payne et al., 2010, Stevens Davidovitz, 2014. Implicit bias can literally get under the skin. Although the number of black medical students has increased, only 5% of U.S. physicians are black. AAMC, 2019, Murphy, 2022. Because black medical providers may challenge people's stereotypes of doctors, researchers examined whether white patients would show less responsiveness to black medical providers' treatment. In one experiment, white patients were exposed to a treatment that caused a mild allergic reaction. Howe et al., 2022. By random assignment, patients received an antihistamine cream that will reduce allergic reaction and itching from a Black, Asian, or white medical provider. In actuality, the cream was a placebo containing no medicine. Even after controlling for explicit attitudes toward Black medical providers, white patients who were assigned a Black medical provider showed the strongest initial allergic reaction and the weakest response to the placebo medical treatment. Implicit bias can have deadly consequences. In 1999, Amadou Diallo, who was Black, was accosted as he approached his New York doorway by police officers looking for a rapist. When he pulled out his wallet, the officers, perceiving a gun, riddled his body with 19 bullets from 41 shots. In one analysis of 59 unarmed suspect shootings in Philadelphia over 7 years, 49 involved the misidentification of an object, such as a phone, or movement, such as pants tugging. Black suspects were more than twice as likely to be misperceived as threatening, even by Black officers. Blow, 2015. Similarly, Black men are about 2.5 times more likely than white men to be killed by a police officer in the United States, even when unarmed. Edwards et al., 2019, Peoples, 2020. Researchers have analyzed implicit bias scores from more than 2 million Americans, while accounting for several other factors. Their finding, a region's implicit bias toward Black Americans predicted its number of Black Americans stopped and killed by police. Hammond et al., 2018, Stelter et al., 2022. And an analysis of more than 2 million U.S. 911 calls revealed that white officers sent to Black neighborhoods fired their guns 5 times as often as Black officers sent for similar calls in the same neighborhoods. Peoples, 2020. Recognizing the reality of implicit bias, many police departments, colleges, and companies have given their staff implicit bias training. Microsoft makes its online implicit bias training available to anyone at. Although such single-session diversity or bias training sessions may modestly change attitudes, real behavior is harder to modify. Greenwald et al., 2022. The enthusiasm for, and monetary investment in, diversity training, say social psychologists Patricia Devine and Tori Ash, 2022, has outpaced the available evidence that such programs are effective. To better understand implicit prejudice, researchers have also simulated situations. Correll et al., 2007, 2015, Plant and Perush, 2005, Sadler et al., 2012. They asked viewers to press buttons quickly to shoot or not shoot men who suddenly appeared on screen. Some of the on-screen men held a gun. Others held a harmless hand tool. People, both Black and white, including police officers, more often shot Black men holding harmless objects than they shot white men holding harmless objects. Priming people with a flashed black face rather than a white face also made them more likely to misperceive a flashed tool as a gun. Figure 43.1. Fatigue, which diminishes one's conscious control and increases automatic reactions, amplifies racial bias in shooting decisions. Ma et al., 2013. Prejudice and biases against people of color have been weaponized by individuals who file false criminal reports. For a glimpse of how U.S. policymakers are addressing this problem, watch this video. States working to curb biased 911 calls. Gender prejudice. In the early 18th century, Dr. James Berry became Britain's first female doctor. Because women were not allowed to attend university, Berry applied to the University of Edinburgh as a man, and went on to a storied career as a military surgeon. Berry's assigned sex was only revealed upon his death. Since then, and especially since 1950, expressed gender stereotypes and prejudice have decreased. Eagley et al., 2020. The one-third of Americans who in 1937 told Gallup pollsters that they would vote for a qualified woman whom their party nominated for president soared to 95% in 2012. Jones, 2012, Newport, 1999. And 94% of people surveyed across 34 countries now agree it is important for women to have the same rights as men, Horowitz and Fetty-Rolf, 2020. Nevertheless, both implicit and explicit gender prejudice and discrimination persist. Consider work and pay. In Western countries, we pay more to those, usually men, who care for our streets than to those, usually women, who care for our children. Despite expressed support for women having the same rights, 40% of the global survey respondents agreed that men have more right to a job when work is scarce. Agreement varied greatly by country, ranging from 7% in Sweden to about 80% in India and Tunisia. Leadership. From 2007 through 2016, male directors of 1,000 popular films, the top 100 for each year, outnumbered female directors by 24-1, Smith et al., 2017. Implicit gender bias also contributes to females not being selected for prestigious scientific research positions, Regner et al., 2019. Perceived intelligence and intellectual interests. Gender bias even applies to beliefs about intelligence. Despite equality between males and females in intelligence test scores, people have tended to perceive their fathers as more intelligent than their mothers and their sons as brighter than their daughters, Fernham, 2016. Children's books often plant the seeds of such gender stereotypes, with girls portrayed as emotional and good readers and boys depicted as interested in tools and excelling in math, Lewis et al., 2022. Masculine norms. Organizations often value and reward masculine ideas, values, and interaction styles, Cherian and Marcus, 2020. For example, people are encouraged to work independently, nominate themselves for awards and promotions, and use an assertive interaction style to influence others. These masculine defaults can reduce women's sense of belonging and increase their feelings of being an imposter, Weil et al., 2022. Until I was a man, I had no idea how good men had it at work. The first time I spoke up in a meeting in my newly low, quiet voice and noticed that sudden, focused attention, I was so uncomfortable that I found myself unable to finish my sentence. Thomas Page McBee, 2016, after transitioning from female to male. Unwanted female infants are no longer left on a hillside to die of exposure, as was the practice in ancient Greece. Yet the average male-to-female newborn ratio, 105-100, doesn't explain the world's millions of missing women. In many cultures, parents value sons more than daughters. In India, there have been 3.5 times more Google searches asking how to conceive a boy than how to conceive a girl, Stevens Davidovitz, 2014. With scientific testing that enables sex-selective abortions, some countries are experiencing a shortfall in female births, figure 43.2. India's newborn sex ratio was recently 111 boys for every 100 girls, though after a Save the Girl Child campaign has dropped to a still high 108, Tong, 2022. China's has been 111-100, despite China's declaring sex-selective abortions a criminal offense, CIA, 2014. In China and India, which together have 50 million more males than females under age 20, many men will be without mates, Denier and Gowan, 2018, Gupta, 2017. When men outnumber women, there is often increased crime, violence, and trafficking of women, Brooks, 2012. LGBTQ prejudice. In most of the world, gay, lesbian, and transgender people cannot openly and comfortably disclose who they are and whom they love. Although 32 countries allowed same-sex marriage by 2022, dozens more had laws criminalizing same-sex relationships. Cultural variation is enormous, ranging from 94% in Sweden who believe homosexuality should be accepted to 7% in Nigeria who agree with that statement. Pew, 2020. Worldwide, anti-gay attitudes have been most common among men, older adults, and those who are unhappy, unemployed, and less educated. Haney, 2016, Jackal and Wenzelberger, 2015. Explicit anti-LGBTQ prejudice persists, even in countries with legal protections in place. When US and UK experimenters sent thousands of responses to employment ads, those whose resumes included Treasurer, Progressive and Socialist Alliance received more replies than did those whose resumes specified Treasurer, Gay and Lesbian Alliance. Agerstrom et al., 2012, Bertrand and Mullainathan, 2004, Drydakis, 2009, 2015. Do attitudes and practices that label, disparage, and discriminate against gay, lesbian, and transgender people increase their risk of psychological disorder and ill health? Yes. In U.S. states without protections against LGBTQ hate crime and discrimination, gay and lesbian people experience substantially higher rates of depression and related disorders, even after controlling for income and education differences. In communities where anti-gay prejudice is high, so are gay and lesbian suicide and cardiovascular deaths. In 16 states that banned same-sex marriage between 2001 and 2005, gay and lesbian people, but not straight people, experienced a 37% increase in depressive disorder rates, a 42% increase in alcohol use disorder, and a 248% increase in generalized anxiety disorder. Meanwhile, gay and lesbian people in other states did not experience increased psychiatric disorders. Hatzenbichler, 2014. So, do laws that promote acceptance of gay, lesbian, and transgender people reduce bias? Again, yes. As happened after the passage of desegregation and civil rights laws, attitudes have followed the newly legislated behavior. In various U.S. states, people became more gay supportive when and where same-sex marriages became legal. Afuzu et al., 2019. Roots of prejudice. LOQ 43-3. What are some social, emotional, and cognitive roots of prejudice, and what are some ways to reduce prejudice? Prejudice springs from a culture's divisions, the heart's passions, and the mind's natural workings. Social inequalities and divisions. When some people have money, power, and prestige and others do not, the haves usually develop attitudes that justify things as they are. The just world phenomenon reflects an idea we commonly teach our children that good is rewarded and evil is punished. From this, it is but a short and sometimes automatic leap to assume that those who succeed must be good and those who suffer must be bad. Such reasoning enables wealthy people to see both their own riches and the misfortunes of those living in poverty as justly deserved. When slavery existed in the United States, slaveholders perceived enslaved people as innately lazy, ignorant, and irresponsible, as having the very traits that supposedly justified enslaving them. Stereotypes rationalize inequalities. People who experience discrimination may react in ways that feed prejudice through the classic blame the victim dynamic. Allport, 1954. Do the circumstances of poverty breed a higher crime rate? If so, that higher crime rate can be used to justify discrimination against those who live in poverty. Dividing the world into us and them can result in conflict, racism, and war, but it also provides the benefits of communal solidarity. Thus, we cheer for our groups, kill for them, die for them. Indeed, we define who we are, our social identity, partly in terms of our groups. Thomas et al., 2020, White House, 2018. When Margarita identifies herself as a woman, a Brit, a Liverpool native, and a Brexit supporter, she knows who she is, and so do we. Mentally drawing a circle defines us. The In-group. But the social definition of who we are also states who we are not. People outside that circle are them, the out-group. An in-group bias soon follows. In experiments, children and adults have favored their own group when dividing rewards, even a group that is created by a mere coin toss. Tagfell, 1982, Win et al., 2018. Across 17 countries, in-group bias appears more as in-group favoritism than as harm to the out-group. Romano et al., 2017. Discrimination is triggered less by out-group hostility than by in-group networking and mutual support, such as hiring a friend's child at the expense of other candidates. Greenwald and Pettigrew, 2014. We have inherited our Stone Age ancestors' need to belong, to live and love in groups. There was safety in solidarity, whether hunting, defending, or attacking. 10 hands were better than 2. Evolution prepared us, when encountering strangers, to make instant judgments, friend or foe. This urge to distinguish enemies from friends, and to dehumanize or otherize those not like us, predisposes prejudice against strangers. Dealey and Landry, 2022, Whitley, 1999. To Greeks of the classical era, all non-Greeks were barbarians. In our own era, most children believe their school is better than all other schools in town. Many high school students form cliques, athletes, choir members, theater actors, and disparage those outside their own group. Even chimpanzees have been seen to wipe clean the spot where they were touched by a chimpanzee from another group. Goodall, 1986. They also display in-group empathy by yawning more after seeing in-group, rather than out-group, members yawn. Campbell and Duvall, 2011. Although an ideal world might prioritize justice and love for all, in our real world, in-group love often outranks universal justice. Ask yourself, what are some examples of in-group bias in your own life, and in your community? How can you help break down barriers that you or others may face? Negative emotions. Negative emotions nourish prejudice. When facing death, fearing threats, or experiencing frustration, people cling more tightly to their in-group. When frustrated by extreme inequality, people worldwide wish for a strong leader to restore order. Sprong et al., 2019. Fearing terrorism increases patriotism, along with loathing and aggression toward those perceived as threats. Pisachinsky et al., 2002, 2008. Scapegoat theory proposes that when things go wrong, finding someone to blame can provide a target for our negative emotions. From 2015 to 2020, as white nationalist political talk surged, FBI reported U.S. hate crimes increased 38%, FBI, 2016, 2021. Social psychologists therefore wondered, do political leaders' words merely voice common prejudices and grievances? Or do they also amplify them? They do both. Leaders cater to their audiences. And when prominent leaders voice prejudices, it becomes more acceptable for their followers to do the same. Thus, counties that hosted Trump rallies in 2016, where then-candidate Donald Trump had targeted Muslims and immigrants, reportedly experienced a doubled rate of hate crimes thereafter. Feinberg et al., 2019. Researchers also have found that frequent and repetitive exposure to hate speech leads to desensitization to such speech and to increasing out-group prejudice. Searle et al., 2018. Political leaders influence norms, and norms matter. People express the prejudices that are socially acceptable and they hide the ones that are not. Crandall and White, 2016. Following the 2016 anti-immigrant Brexit referendum in England and Wales, hate crimes soared from 52,000 in 2015/2016 to 103,000 in 2018/2019, Home Office, 2019. There, and in the United States, Anti-Semitic crimes have also increased. ADL, 2022, Goodwin and Green, 2022. During the COVID-19 pandemic, some government officials in white-majority countries referred to the virus as Chinese or China virus. Associating the virus with a country fueled prejudice and discrimination, with 1 in 3 Asian Americans experiencing racial or ethnic slurs since the outbreak, and 1 in 4 fearing physical attack. Ruiz et al., 2020. U.S. psychologists have documented increased anti-Asian prejudice and called for greater advocacy to educate people about COVID-19 racial bias and build empathy toward Asian Americans. Chen et al., 2021. Evidence for the scapegoat theory comes in 2 forms. 1. Social trends. Economically frustrated people often express heightened prejudice, and during economic downturns, racial prejudice intensifies. Bianchi et al., 2018, and 2. Experiments. Temporarily frustrating people intensifies their prejudice. Researchers have found that students who experience failure or are made to feel insecure often restore their self-esteem by disparaging a rival school or another person. Cialdini and Richardson, 1980, Crocker et al., 1987. Denigrating others may boost our own sense of status, which explains why a rival's misfortune sometimes provides a twinge of pleasure. The German language has a word Schadenfreude for the secret joy that we sometimes take in another's failure. By contrast, those made to feel loved and supported become more open to and accepting of others who differ. Mikulinker and Shaver, 2001. The misfortunes of others are the taste of honey. Japanese saying. Cognitive shortcuts. Stereotyped beliefs are a byproduct of how we cognitively simplify the world. To help understand the world around us, we frequently form categories. Chemists categorize molecules as organic and inorganic. Therapists categorize psychological disorders. We all categorize people by gender, ethnicity, race, age, and many other characteristics including their warmth and their competence. Fisk, 2018. But when we categorize people into groups, we often stereotype. We recognize how greatly we differ from other individuals in our groups. But we overestimate the extent to which members of other groups are alike. Bothwell et al., 1989. We perceive outgroup homogeneity, uniformity of attitudes, personality, and appearance. Our greater recognition for individual own race faces called the other race effect, or cross-race effect or own race bias, emerges during infancy, between 3 and 9 months of age, also a period when babies learn to distinguish the sounds of their language. Anzures et al., 2013, Telzer et al., 2013. Infant brains become attuned to small differences in familiar sounds and faces. We also have an own age bias, better recognition memory for faces of our own age group. Cronin et al., 2021, Rhodes and Anastasi, 2012. For a story that shows the real-life ramifications of the other race effect, watch this video, Racial Bias and Facial Recognition Software. Sometimes, however, people don't fit easily into our racial categories. When that happens, we often assign them to their outgroup identity. Researchers believe this happens because, after learning the features of a familiar racial group, the observer's selective attention is drawn to the distinctive features of the less familiar outgroup. One study illustrated this learned association effect by showing research participants blended Chinese white faces. Halbierstadt et al., 2011. Compared with participants of Chinese descent, European descent participants more readily classified ambiguous faces as Chinese. Figure 43.3. With effort and experience, people get better at recognizing individual faces from another group. Hugenberg et al., 2010, Young et al., 2012. Remembering vivid cases. We also simplify our world by employing heuristics, mental shortcuts that enable snap judgments. The availability heuristic is the tendency to estimate the frequency of an event by how readily it comes to mind. Vivid cases come to mind easily, so it's no surprise that they feed our stereotypes. In a classic experiment, researchers showed two groups of students lists containing information about 50 men, Rothbard et al., 1978. The first group's list included 10 men arrested for nonviolent crimes, such as forgery. The second group's list included 10 men arrested for violent crimes, such as assault. Later, both groups were asked how many men on their list had committed any sort of crime. The second group overestimated the number. Violent crimes form vivid memories, figure 43.4. For a synopsis of the social and cognitive psychology of prejudice, watch this video, Prejudice. Victim blaming. As we noted earlier, people often justify their prejudices by blaming victims. If the world is just, they assume, people must get what they deserve, and believing this makes us feel better. Napier et al., 2020. As one German civilian is said to have remarked when visiting the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp shortly after World War II, what terrible criminals these prisoners must have been to receive such treatment. Hindsight bias amplifies victim blaming, Carley and Leonard, 1989. Have you ever heard people say that rape victims, abused spouses, or people with AIDS got what they deserved? In some countries, such as Pakistan, rape victims have been sentenced to severe punishment for violating adultery prohibitions. Maidans, 2002. In one experiment, two groups received a detailed account of a date. Janoff Bullman et al., 1985. The first group's account ended with the woman being raped. Members of that group perceived the woman's behavior as at least partly to blame, and in hindsight, they thought, she should have known better. The second group, given the same account with the rape ending deleted, did not perceive the woman's behavior as inviting rape. In the first group, hindsight bias promoted a blame the victim mentality. Blaming the victim reassures people that it couldn't happen to them. People also tend to justify their culture's social systems. Jost, 2020. We're inclined to see the way things are as the way they ought to be and deserve to be. If people are rich, they must be smart. Husak and Simpian, 2015. This natural resistance to change makes it difficult to legislate major social changes, such as healthcare improvements or climate change policies. Once policies are in place, system justification tends to preserve them. If your own gut check reveals you sometimes have feelings you would rather not have about other people, remember this: it is what we do with our feelings that matters. By monitoring our feelings and actions, by replacing old habits with new ones, and by seeking out new friendships, we can work to free ourselves from prejudice. Retrieval practice. Answers in Appendix E. Aggression. LOQ 43-4. How does psychology's definition of aggression differ from everyday usage? What biological factors make us more prone to hurt one another? In psychology, aggression is any physical or verbal behavior intended to harm someone, whether done out of hostility or as a calculated means to an end. The assertive, persistent salesperson is not aggressive. Nor is the dentist who makes you wince with pain. But the gossip who passes along a vicious rumor about you, the bully who torments you in person or online, and the attacker who robs you are aggressive. Remember, aggression is a behavior. You must do something to act aggressively. Feeling anger or thinking aggressive thoughts don't qualify as aggression. Aggression emerges from the interaction of biology and experience. For a gun to fire, the trigger must be pulled. With some people, as with hair trigger guns, it doesn't take much to trip an explosion. What do you think? Do guns in the home save or take more lives? Personal safety/protection is the #1 reason people in the United States have given for gun ownership, Swift, 2013. However, firearm ownership can backfire. Guns in the home are much more often used to kill family members or oneself than in self-defense. Kivisto et al., 2019, Stroebe et al., 2017. In 2020, 45,222 Americans died from firearms, nearly 6 in 10 were suicides, CDC, 2022. Over the last half-century more than 1.5 million Americans have suffered non-war firearm deaths, more than all war deaths in U.S. history, Jacobson, 2015. Compared with people of the same sex, race, age, and neighborhood, those who keep a gun in their home have been twice as likely to be murdered and 3 times as likely to die by suicide. Engelmeyer et al., 2014, Stroebe, 2013. U.S. states with high gun ownership rates also tend to have high gun homicide rates. Correlation R equals 0.82, figure 43.5. It takes Japan nearly a decade to accumulate as many violent gun deaths as occur in an average U.S. day. More guns rightward arrow more deaths. In the discussions that follow, we will look first at some biological factors that influence our thresholds for aggressive behavior, then at the psychological factors that pull the trigger. The biology of aggression. Aggression varies too widely from culture to culture, era to era, and person to person to be considered an unlearned instinct. But biology does influence aggression. We can look for biological influences at 3 levels: genetic, neural, and biochemical. Genetic influences. Genes influence aggression. Animals have been bred for aggressiveness, sometimes for sport, sometimes for research. The effect of genes also appears in human twin studies. Miles and Carey, 1997, Rowe et al., 1999. If one identical twin admits to having a violent temper, the other twin will often independently admit the same. Fraternal twins are much less likely to respond similarly. Researchers continue to search for genetic markers in those who commit violent acts. One is already well known and is carried by half the human race, the Y chromosome. Men are 4 times more likely than women to commit violent crime, FBI, 2022. Another such marker is the monoamine oxidase A, MAOA, gene, sometimes called the warrior gene, which is involved in breaking down neurotransmitters such as dopamine and serotonin. People who have low MAOA gene expression tend to behave aggressively when provoked. In one experiment, low, compared with high, MAOA gene carriers gave more unpleasant hot sauce to someone who provoked them. McDermott et al., 2009, Tyahanan et al., 2015. Watch this video, Twin Studies, for a helpful tutorial animation. Neural influences. There is no one spot in the brain that controls aggression. Aggression is a complex behavior, and it occurs in particular contexts. But animal and human brains have neural systems that, given provocation, will either inhibit or facilitate aggression. Faulkner et al., 2016, Fields, 2019. Consider. Researchers implanted a radio-controlled electrode in the brain of the domineering leader of a caged monkey colony. The electrode was in an area that, when stimulated, inhibited the leader's aggression. When researchers placed the control button for the electrode in the colony's cage, one small monkey learned to push it every time the boss became threatening. A neurosurgeon, seeking to diagnose a disorder, implanted an electrode in the amygdala of a mild-mannered woman. Because the brain has no sensory receptors, she was unable to feel the stimulation. But at the flick of a switch she snarled, "Take my blood pressure. Take it now," then stood up and began to strike the doctor. Moyer, 1983. If the frontal lobes are damaged, inactive, disconnected, or not yet fully mature, aggression may be more likely. Amen et al., 1996, Davidson et al., 2000, Rain, 2013. One study of 203 convicted murderers revealed reduced tissue in the frontal lobes, suggests Turner et al., 2020. Biochemical influences. Our genes engineer our individual nervous systems, which operate electrochemically. The hormone testosterone, for example, circulates in the bloodstream and influences the neural systems that influence aggression. A raging bull becomes a gentle giant when castration reduces its testosterone level. Conversely, when injected with testosterone, gentle, castrated mice become aggressive. Humans are less sensitive to hormonal changes. But as men's testosterone levels diminish with age, hormonally charged, aggressive 17-year-olds mature into quieter and gentler 50-year-olds. Drugs that sharply reduce testosterone levels subdue men's aggressive tendencies. We could avoid 2/3 of all crime simply by putting all able-bodied young men in cryogenic sleep from the age of 12 through 28. David T. Leakin, The Antisocial Personalities, 1995. Another drug that sometimes circulates in the bloodstream, alcohol, unleashes aggressive responses to frustration. Across police data, prison surveys, and experiments, aggression-prone people are more likely to drink, and to become violent when intoxicated. White et al., 1993. Alcohol is a disinhibitor. It slows the brain activity that controls judgment and inhibitions. Under its influence, people may interpret ambiguous acts, such as being bumped in a crowd, as provocations and react aggressively. Big et al., 2010, Jankola and Corman, 2007. Alcohol consumption has been a factor in 1 in 3 U.S. homicides. Alpert et al., 2022. In countries that have restricted alcohol sales by reducing alcohol's availability or increasing its price, homicides have dropped. Trangenstein et al., 2021. Just thinking you've imbibed alcohol can increase aggression. Big et al., 2009. But so, too, does unknowingly ingesting alcohol slipped into a drink. Thus, alcohol affects aggression both biologically and psychologically. Bushman, 1993, ITO et al., 1996. Psychological and social cultural factors in aggression. LOQ 43-5. What psychological and social cultural factors may trigger aggressive behavior? Biological factors influence how easily aggression is triggered. But what psychological and social cultural factors pull the trigger? Aversive events, hurt people. Suffering sometimes builds character. In both laboratory experiments and everyday life, however, those made miserable have often made others miserable. Berkowitz, 1983, 1989, O'Connor et al., 2021. Aversive stimuli, hot temperatures, physical pain, personal insults, foul odors, cigarette smoke, crowding, and a host of others can evoke hostility. Even hunger can feed anger, making people hangry. Bushman et al., 2014. A prime example of this phenomenon is the frustration-aggression principle. Frustration creates anger, which can spark aggression. The frustration-aggression link was illustrated in an analysis of 27,667 hit-by-pitch Major League Baseball incidents between 1960 and 2004, Timmerman, 2007. Pitchers were most likely to hit batters when the previous batter had hit a home run, the current batter had hit a home run the last time at bat, or a pitch had hit the pitcher's teammate in the previous half inning. A separate study found a similar link between rising temperatures and the number of hit batters. Riefman et al., 1991, see figure 43.6. Overheated temperatures, rightward arrow, overheated tempers. Worldwide, Violent crime and spousal abuse rates have been higher during hotter years, seasons, months, and days. Anderson et al., 1997, Heilman and Kahn, 2019. Studies from archaeology, economics, geography, political science, and psychology converge in finding that throughout human history, higher temperatures have predicted increased individual violence, wars, and revolutions. Shang et al., 2013. One projection from available data estimates that global warming of 4 degrees Fahrenheit, about 2 degrees Celsius, could induce tens of thousands of additional assaults and murders. Miles Novello and Anderson, 2022. And that's before the added violence inducements from climate change, related drought, poverty, food insecurity, and migration. Reinforcement and modeling. Aggression may naturally follow aversive events, but learning can alter natural reactions. We learn when our behavior is reinforced, and we learn by watching others. In situations where experience has taught us that aggression pays, we are likely to act aggressively again. Children whose aggression has successfully intimidated other children may become bullies. Animals that have successfully fought to get food or mates become increasingly ferocious. To foster a kinder, gentler world, we had best model and reward sensitivity and cooperation from an early age, perhaps by training parents to discipline without modeling violence. Parent training programs often advise parents to avoid screaming and hitting. Instead, they can reward desirable behaviors and frame statements positively. Kajdan, 2018. Rather than say, "If you don't clean your room, you'll be in big trouble," say, "When you clean your room, you can go play." Different cultures model, reinforce, and evoke different tendencies toward violence. Between 1882 and 1926, lynch mobs in the U.S. state of Georgia murdered 514 people. The best predictors of this collective violence were cultural norms that encouraged and supported lynching. Ritchie and Rybak, 2018. But other factors also matter. Crime rates have been higher and average happiness lower in times and places marked by a great disparity between rich and poor. Meshes et al., 2011, Oishi et al., 2011, Wilkinson and Pickett, 2009. And Fathers Matter, Tria and DIS, 1994. Even after controlling for parental education, race, income, and teen motherhood, U.S. male youths from father-absent homes have been incarcerated at twice the rate of their peers. Harper and McClanahan, 2004. Violence can vary by culture within a country. The U.S. South, for example, has long had a culture of honor. Richard Nisbet and Dov Cohen, 1996, analyzed violence among white Americans in southern towns settled by Scots-Irish herders whose tradition encouraged violent response to insult, the use of arms to protect one's flock, and slavery. Compared with their white counterparts in New England towns settled by the more traditionally peaceful Puritan, Quaker, and Dutch farmer artisans, the cultural descendants of those herders had triple the homicide rates and were more supportive of physically punishing children, of wars, and of uncontrolled gun ownership. Today's culture of honor traditions remain influential, encouraging people to use weapons to defend their honor and to not back down. Gould et al., 2021, Lance and Wenger, 2021. Media models for violence. Television, films, video games, and the internet offer supersized portions of violence. An adolescent boy faced with a real-life challenge may act like a man, at least like an action film man, by intimidating or eliminating the threat. Media violence teaches us. Social scripts culturally provided mental files for how to act in certain situations. As more than 100 studies confirm, we sometimes imitate what we viewed. Watching media depictions of risk-glorifying behaviors, dangerous driving, extreme sports, unprotected sex, increases real-life risk-taking. Fisher et al., 2011. Watching violent behaviors, murder, robbery, can increase real-life aggressiveness. Anderson et al., 2017. Music lyrics also teach us social scripts. In one study, German university men who listened to woman-hating lyrics poured the hottest chili sauce for a woman to consume. They also recalled more negative feelings and beliefs about women. Listening to man-hating lyrics similarly affected women. Fisher and Griedemeyer, 2006. How does repeatedly watching pornographic films affect viewers? Just as repeated viewing of on-screen violence helps immunize us to aggression, repeated viewing of pornography, even non-violent pornography, has made sexual aggression seem less serious. Harris, 1994. In one experiment, undergraduates viewed 6 brief films weekly for 6 weeks. Zillman and Bryant, 1984. Some viewed sexually explicit films, others viewed films with no sexual content. 3 weeks later, both groups, after reading a report about a man convicted of raping a female hitchhiker, suggested an appropriate prison term. Compared with sentences recommended by the control group, the sex film viewers recommended terms that were half as long. In other studies that explored pornography's effects on aggression toward relationship partners, pornography consumption predicted both self-reported aggression and participants' willingness to administer laboratory noise blasts to their partner. Lambert et al., 2011, Peter and Valkenburg, 2016. Pornography acts mostly by adding fuel to a fire. It heightens the risk of sexual aggression primarily among aggression-prone men. Malamuth, 2018. Researchers debate pornography's influence on healthy relationships and sexuality. Grubbs and Krause, 2021, Zimbardo and Coulomb, 2021. Some experiments suggest that pornography with violent sexual content can increase men's readiness to behave aggressively toward women. As a long ago statement by 21 social scientists noted, pornography that portrays sexual aggression as pleasurable for the victim increases the acceptance of the use of coercion in sexual relations. Surgeon General, 1986. Analyzing 166 studies involving 125,000 participants, some of today's researchers reached a similar conclusion: exposure to sexualized media, especially in combination with violence, has negative effects on women, particularly on what people think about them and how aggressively they treat them. Benoit et al., 2022. Do violent video games teach social scripts for violence? Experiments worldwide indicate that playing positive games produces positive effects. Griedemeyer and Mugge, 2014, Prot et al., 2014. For example, playing the classic video game Lemmings, where a goal was to help others, increased real-life helping. So, might a similar effect occur after playing games that enact violence? Violent video games became an issue for public debate after teenagers in more than a dozen places seemed to mimic the carnage in the first-person shooter games they had so often played. Anderson, 2004, 2013. Such incidents of violent mimicry make us wonder, what are the effects of actively role-playing aggression? Does it cause people to become less sensitive to violence and more open to violent acts? Amid conflicting findings, nearly 400 studies of 130,000 people offer some answers. Calvert et al., 2017, Kim et al., 2021. Violent video game playing tends to make us less sensitive to cruelty. Arriaga et al., 2015. Video games can prime aggressive thoughts, decrease empathy, and induce us to respond aggressively when provoked. University men who spend the most hours playing violent video games have also tended to be the most physically aggressive. Anderson and Dill, 2000. For example, they more often acknowledged having hit or attacked someone else. More than 24 longitudinal studies have found that violent video game playing predicts more bullying and physical violence. Prescott et al., 2018, 10 et al., 2022. In experiments, people who were randomly assigned to play a game involving bloody murders with groaning victims, rather than to play non-violent games, became more hostile. On a follow-up task, they were more likely to blast intense noise at a fellow student. Studies of young adolescents revealed that those who played a lot of violent video games became more aggressive and saw the world as more hostile. Bushman, 2016, Exelmans et al., 2015, Gentile, 2009. Compared with non-gaming kids, they got into more arguments and fights and earned poorer grades. In another experiment, children who played a video game with gun violence, rather than sword violence or no violence, later became more likely to touch, pick up, and pull the trigger on a real, but disabled, gun. Chang and Bushman, 2019. But is this merely because naturally hostile kids are drawn to such games? Griedemeyer et al., 2019? Apparently not. Comparisons of both gamers and non-gamers who scored low on hostility measures revealed a difference in the number of fights they reported. Almost 4 in 10 violent game players had been in fights, compared with only 4 in 100 of the non-gaming kids. Anderson, 2004. Some researchers believe that, due partly to the more active participation and rewarded violence of gameplay, violent video games have even greater effects on aggressive behavior and cognition than do violent TV shows and movies. Anderson and Warburton, 2012. Research demonstrates a consistent relation between violent video game use and increases in aggressive behavior, aggressive cognitions and aggressive affect, and decreases in prosocial behavior, empathy, and sensitivity to aggression. American Psychological Association Task Force on Violent Media, 2015. Other researchers are unimpressed by such findings. Ferguson et al., 2020, Markey and Ferguson, 2018. They note that although video game sales have increased, youth violence has declined. They argue that the best studies find minimal effects and that other factors, depression, family violence, peer influence, and a gun-toting culture better predict aggression. Although some commentators have tried to blame modern mass shootings on violent video games, most researchers agree that they are, at worst, only one modest contributor to social violence. APA, 2019, Mather and Vanderwill, 2019. Study finds exposure to violent children causes increased aggression in video game characters. The Satirical Onion, March 6, 2017. To sum up, research reveals biological, psychological, and social cultural influences on aggressive behavior. Complex behaviors, including violence, have many causes, making any single explanation an oversimplification. Asking what causes violence is therefore like asking what causes cancer. Those who study the effects of asbestos exposure on cancer rates may remind us that asbestos is indeed a cancer cause, but it is only one among many. Like so much else, aggression is a biopsychosocial phenomenon, figure 43.7. A happy concluding note: historical trends suggest that the world is becoming less violent over time. Pinker, 2011, 2018. That people vary across time and place reminds us that environments differ. Yesterday's plundering Vikings have become today's peace-promoting Scandinavians. Like all behavior, aggression arises from the interaction of persons and situations. Ask yourself: in what ways have you been affected by social scripts for aggression? Have your viewing and gaming habits influenced these social scripts? Retrieval practice. Answers in Appendix E. Review. Module 43, Antisocial Relations. Learning objectives. Test yourself. Answer these repeated learning objective questions on your own, before showing the answers here, or checking the answers in Appendix D, to improve your retention of the concepts. McDaniel et al., 2009, 2015. Terms and concepts to remember. Test yourself, write down the definition in your own words, then check your answer. Prejudice. Stereotype. Discrimination. Implicit bias. Just world phenomenon. In-group. Out-group. In-group bias. Scapegoat theory. Other race effect. Aggression. Frustration-aggression principle. Social script. Module test. Test yourself, answer the following questions on your own first, then show the answers here, or check your answers in Appendix E.